Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Masters of Code, our video series wherein we talk to technologists about technology and everything around it. I'm your host, Alok Soni, and today I'm glad to host Ranjit Radhakrishnan, Chief Product Officer of BYJU, to be talking on something very interesting and very off the track, but again, very relevant to the world we live in. That's stories and games in building products and teams. Basically, we're going to talk about the role of storytelling and game design principles in terms of building better products, in terms of building cross-functional consensus, and in terms of scaling mission-oriented products. Ranjit, glad to have you.
Glad to be here, Alok. Thank you.
So before we get into dissecting the questions and parts of it, I want to know that why is this topic so close to you?
For me, it stretches back to when as a child, right? As in when you kind of are learning a lot of new things. The best way that I learned anything in my life was structuring that into a game, right? This could be me mastering math or science or even any extracurricular activities, be it sports, right? The idea was to kind of simplify it, make it into some sort of a structure, some rules, some patterns, and then bring about some goals. And the smaller goals you get to master, and then you can build on top of it, right? So there was structure in games. And at the end of the day, when you are crafting out your journey, right, from being a young child to a teenager to an adult who's building his career, I think the importance of storytelling and narrative, right? Because that's how you motivate yourself. That's how you kind of pump yourself up. That's how you kind of look at, okay, what are you kind of working towards? What's the journey that is interesting for you? And what is the narrative that you want to be able to tell about your career, say 20 years hence? That's how I have always thought about the structure, right? Storytelling and game design principles have been very close to heart. And I've been, applying them in product management, because I believe that at the end of the day, game design and storytelling is all about understanding human psyche, their behavior patterns, and it's very fundamental to us as humans, right? And building products is also for solving problems for users at the end of the day, right? And at the end of the day, when users are engaging with your product, it's all about how they feel, right? And what that narrative does for them, right? So I think at the end of the day, all of that was something that I kind of found a very close connection with. And I was lucky enough to kind of also work in certain places where, I spent some time in Zynga building games in the pre-IPO times. And while games were wonderful, the reason that I gravitated towards games is because I was a gamer myself. But beyond that, I understood that once I started building games, that these principles are not just limited to just games. They can be applied to every facet of life, right? Because that's how it kind of functions. So I was very interested in taking those things that I kind of learned in Zynga and in the process of playing games and applying it across sectors. And that's how my journey's been post that as well. So that's why I think these two topics, when it comes to Ford, I get very passionate about it, and I kind of engage with even my team and peers closely, talking about how these principles can be applied on an everyday basis.
Got it. Fair enough. Let's take a deep dive now into it one by one. So first of all, storytelling. A lot has been spoken about storytelling, content, and storytelling in particular I'll say that, and it has been, I think, kept on amplifying over the last half a decade or so, especially if you talk about the startup ecosystem or in general, the entire product ecosystem. So how can, if I objectively have to ask, but right, because one is subjective and we talk and we know it's important, but objectively, if I have to ask and pinpoint that in terms of product development in that journey, where does storytelling plays a very, very important role and kind of adds something which cannot be added by other elements?
Storytelling needs to be at the core of it. And this is not just lip service to the saying storytelling is fancy, let's incorporate some part of it. I think it's central to what we do as product builders, right? Whether you're engineering something, you're engineering a solution, you're engineering an experience, you're engineering a functionality being solved for a particular user, a user who believes that he's the center of the universe and has problems to be solved. So that's a narrative, there's a storytelling aspect to even product building from an engineering perspective. When it comes down to building teams, teams are a clan. They're a group of people who are working towards a common mission, right? And there are emotions involved. They're not just machines working towards a particular purpose, right? There are human emotions involved. There are motivations, demotivators. There is collaboration. There are challenges in the process of collaboration. To be able to build a great team as well, you need to be able to craft a powerful story. Now it's a team coming together to achieve a product experience for the hero, which is the user at the end of the day, right? So you see that all elements of storytelling is naturally kind of present, right? So you have a premise. The user is the hero of the journey. At the end of the day, the user has an existential problem. There is a current situation that kind of exists, and there are problems that need to be resolved. And then the classic story premise, these problems need to be surmounted. Challenges are very, very deep. Then your product comes as a solution, right? And helps or rather becomes tools and weapons in the hands of the hero to be able to master and, solve a particular set of problems, and then the happily ever after, right? So the elements of storytelling is naturally baked into the product development process, right? And now, in terms of getting your initial vision out, right? It's very simple to just say, okay, we're building this functionality. This is what it's going to solve. But if you were to enhance that and bring the level of narrative even to a higher level, where you crafted this the way that I kind of described as a hero's journey, or any other story elements or structure that you want to kind of bring about, then it becomes clear to us, right? Because naturally we have understood and try to kind of get whatever we want as kids by telling stories. We tell stories to our parents to tell them, okay, this is why I want something, right? So we understand the language of stories. And it's easy to bring that one single story. And I talk about this in the org as well. The org, right? The product building org and the business org that kind of functions along with that, the operations org that functions along with that. The challenge in most orgs is that all of them have different stories. They have different problems. They have different, things that they are looking to solve. And somewhere the user or the hero at the center of the journey might get lost out, or everybody might have their own perspective of what challenges the user faces. So to be able to bring an org down to a single story narrative of who the hero is, what the journey is, what is the role that we are playing as a company and as various teams in helping the users surmount this journey and to kind of win successfully, that single narrative has to be the unifying force for orgs functioning, not just for product development. And bringing that narrative together, I think is very, very powerful in terms of driving that singular vision, no confusion, teams are aligned, right? Because at the end of the day, they know that they're playing an important part in that particular story. So it's a very powerful tool for building teams, for getting org level, structure and vision clarity out there. And also the product development process naturally benefits from storytelling.
Thanks for sharing that, Ranjit. But I have a question on what you said. That while it's important to build this narrative, right, and it plays a very important role, rightly you said that in terms of aligning the entire organization, in terms of building the team, in terms of the product development, but somewhere how to ensure that it's not just the leader, because usually it's misconstrued at times that it's the job of the leader only to do it. How to make it a very inclusive process in the way that if I'm just a team member, right, and I also have an idea of what user feels and I want to contribute and I want to feel that this is not just the story of a leader, but this is my story also. So how do you make this entire thing inclusive?
I think one important tool that works in that exercise is you define your characters very, very well, right? So an org is working, for example, in case of BYJU's, we might be building 4 different kinds of students coming from various backgrounds. User personas, while they've been a much tarnished word in certain elements, it's just there, no one uses it. But if you really bring about personas very strongly, they're a very critical part of your storytelling process, right? Because we are very clearly defined. This is the user persona. This is the person. You put a name, you put a set of personality traits, aspirations, background, ethnography, whatever you want to kind of do, right? And you actually can interview actual users to, create, okay, this is the mental model of the user. Put them up loud and clear, right? And get your teams to contribute to this user persona, and they will contribute. Because they'll say, okay, this child is struggling out here from this specific background. This all could be imaginary. But at the end of the day, they are all contributing to kind of build out this character, which they deeply kind of associate with and whose personality traits everybody kind of really understands. So tomorrow, now you're going to prioritize a feature, say, right? You're going to say, okay, this feature is, primarily for this user persona, solves these problems. And at that point of time, you have a steady reference, because this body of knowledge of who this person is, what the person's aspirations are, how the product journey is for the user right now, where do you want to kind of take to those conversations becomes a lot more definite, as opposed to it being very, very generic out there. You can say, okay, Ashish is the character we're talking about. We all know Ashish. This is a user persona, right? This is the background. This is how he's engaging. This is how his story journey looks like within the product ecosystem. Now, we believe that these challenges do exist. These need to be surmounted. Come on, let's ideate on what can happen, right? So then it's them all contributing, and the context is very, very clear. It's the same for all of them, right? And then everybody can contribute ideas at the end of the day. And then the prioritization exercise based on how much change you're bringing to the life of that user persona becomes very, very clear, right? Because everybody might have some subjective change in terms of how much the impact might be, but at least there's a lot of a unifying thought forces. So at the end of the day, I think user personas put at the center of the product development process, and that's not just the engineers, the design team, or the product team. If you can get that conversation into the language of, say, the business team and the operations team as well, right, then it becomes very, very central, right? Because then it's very, very clear, okay, there's in our overall target segment, we know that the clustering is like this segmentation of our user personas, we're building this for this specific purpose. Let's see whether it's aligned to the business goals and whether it's going to drive our core metrics and all of that, right? So I think that's one important tool. Along with user personas, like I said, the story journey, the story map of how the user's journey is with us, getting all of those printed out and very clearly distributed to the team. And at the start of every ideation discussion or a product prioritization discussion, if that's shown and reinforced, right, and then the rest of the meeting happens, then the meeting also tend to be tighter, because a lot of the time is spent in convincing each other, right? And that's a tragic thing for an org to be in, where half the time meetings are all about convincing. You're supposed to be inspiring people to work towards a mission, as opposed to convincing various teams to contribute to something. Right, so there are different mindsets in terms of how we kind of approach that. That can only come by if you reinforce the user persona, the character that you're solving for, very clearly get onto the same problem statements that they are facing, and then ideate. Then the meeting becomes tight, and then we talk about how much difference we want to make in the life of the specific hero, right? Then the inspiration comes by, and the ideation kind of goes through very, very easily. So these are some of the simple tools that we use internally to be able to do that.
Fair enough. Makes sense. So we'll discuss storytelling in later stage now, and let's jump to the game design principle side of the things. So if I have to ask you that, can you pinpoint and give some anecdotes in terms of what are some of the game design principles which you have applied in your journey? Let's say at BYJU's or elsewhere, but let's focus on BYJU's maybe. Then what are those some of the game design principles which you have seen, you have applied and have resulted in something substantially good?
Yeah. So I think upfront would want to call out that game design principles are very foundational, very fundamental. They're not necessarily just gamification, right? Because gamification is a much abused word. It's all about, when you say gamification, people are just like, oh, Ranjit, how do I kind of include a leaderboard? What's the point? What sort of badges should I kind of include? Those are all very simplistic, and I think the wrong way to kind of go about, adding mechanisms. Those are all mechanisms. The mechanics of a particular approach, which could be, say, a leaderboard mechanic, it could be a collection mechanic, it could be an achievement mechanic, all those kind of exist. But at the end of the day, all of these mechanics are with the purpose of driving a specific human motivation or a need being fulfilled. Now, this could be a sense of progression, right? Humans like a sense of progression. They like the big aha achievement milestone movements. They like collecting things and organizing things out there, right? These are all fundamental motivations that people, they like to compete. In some instances, they like to collaborate and work along with other people. These are all fundamental human motivations. And those are what, when we kind of say game design principles, they're supposed to be tackling that. Now, the way that you achieve that could be anything. You might be using a leaderboard or a point system or something else. It could be as simple as including storytelling itself, right? You can always, the narrative aspect of it is very important in game design principles because it makes you care. That's the human emotion part of it. You might say in the learning process, for example, in BYJU's, in certain points, we said that when they're introduced to a concept for the first time and they kind of are mastering it, let there be no competition. Because that's not the mindset that when starting off with the learning process on a new topic, they're not here to be judged. They're only here to kind of consume and kind of understand the concept. At that point of time, when we did the surveys with students out there and kind of understand how to kind of apply this, the motivation was not competition. The motivation was understanding and to be able to say that, okay, I know what my stimuli is telling me, what are the various environmental elements, whether it's information, whether it's knowledge, whether it's problems to be solved. I'm comfortable, right? So comfort was the primary element or the word that was kind of coming by as a human need. So if that is the case, I will not tack on a point system. I will not tack on a leaderboard when the user is doing the learn journey or the practice part of it, because he or she is not ready to be competing at that point of time. There, the individual objective was mastery, self-excellence, understanding. So the way that we structured the journey, right? It was all about progress, individual milestones. We're congratulating them for pushing themselves, and there is no relative stats. You attempted 3 questions in between when you're learning those videos. We will not tell you what percentile you stand in or how many students got it right. because those are irrelevant. Those are all demotivators which comes by in the individual journey at that point in time. Now that the child is done with the learned journeys and the practice, and say now that the child is focused on, okay, I now need to know where I kind of stand. That's the explicit human motivation that's coming by clearly. At that point of time, telling where the student stands relative, how to kind of make that fun, right? Even if they're kind of doing a little, poorly compared to their peers, how do we motivate them? Even the messaging, right? So you're almost there, right? The near miss part of it is a human motivation. Dopamine hit happens when you have a near miss, right? When you find that other peers are also kind of doing similar to you, that's oxytocin, right? Your trust, your happiness kind of kicks in. So understanding that and structuring systems based on where the user's journey is very important, right? As opposed to just stacking on, we have gamified our app, we have added multiple leaderboards and points and badges. That's irrelevant, right? It's all about understanding where the child's journey is or the user's journey is and figuring out what that human motivation is and crafting out very simple systems to cater to that. So that's the nuance. And we had a lot of differences. So I remember back in 2017 itself, when we did this complete change, right? Because we changed the approach. We divided the journey of the child in the learning process into different mindsets, different contexts, different time frames, right? And said, okay, we need to kind of structure the app's language, the messaging, the UI to cater to that singular objective that the child has at that point of time, right? So that post-release, nearly a 30 to 50% bump in the overall metrics is what we saw in terms of learn time, all of that, because it's just cosmetic, it was just packaging, and it was of course, some elements being introduced, but the delta was to that extent in a very short span of
time. Got it. So this is with respect to the product development side of the thing. But if I talk about within the team, in terms of team building or aligning the team, in those cases, what kind of game design principles come into play? And also, I want to know that is it recommended that there's some sort of tools or workshops or something which you should be a part of or kind of follow? Or it's like you mentioned that they should be just a foundational practice in general when you talk about the game design principles and incorporating them?
There are frameworks. There are frameworks to understand this. I would recommend the Octalysis framework. There are frameworks for understanding how fun is structured, the human. There are multiple. If you just look up online, right? And I'll certainly recommend the Octalysis framework because Yuka Chow has done a good job with structuring that into a nice framework. Now, where people struggle with is that framework exists. It's a large set of human motivations and systems that could be mapped to those. But people struggle with how to apply them, right? So I think there is a lot of trouble in terms of being able to translate that framework into actual daily practice because it might seem a lot complicated. But for the teams, right, I think at a very generic level, my first conversation with the teams itself, right, when you're talking about somebody building their career, right, I always tell them, hey, when they kind of join, and we have this first conversation, right, saying, okay, you're joining the team, this is where you're starting off with. We try to do that from a storytelling perspective and also tell them, okay, let's set your goals. Your goals have to be set up just like your missions are set up in, when you play missions in games, there's a quest, you're excited about it. Let's convert your OKR process into being able to structure that into a game, right? And the game, of course, there's a larger quest which the company is working towards, and your quest is supposed to be a sub quest in helping the company being able to kind of achieve that, right? Let's see whether there's alignment, and then let's see how you break those things down. So instead of making it a very, a very strict process, or rather a very serious process, you can make OKRs very nicely done in a very fun fashion, right? Very clear objectives. It helps for it to be quantifiable, measurable, wherever it's possible. But why are you doing that? You're doing that so that they can know that they've achieved that mission or that quest is complete, and then for them to be able to say tick, right? That is essentially the human motivation to be able to say that I've achieved my goal. The goal is very, very clear, right? In games, you have different kinds of games. You have sandbox games where there's no goals. It's just open, field where you can go and do whatever. But in structured games, you might have certain quests and missions. And we structure each quarter or each 6-month period for a particular individual into a mission, right? And that is linked to larger missions that the pod is working towards or the org is working towards. I think that alignment becomes very, very easy. When we talk about, okay, you want to spend 2-3 years out here, think about the narrative that you want to be able to say about you, right? 3 years, because we're all heroes in our own journeys, right? We're all, at the center of our journey, and our career also is at the end of the day a product or a journey that we're kind of experiencing. And when 3 years later, when you have to talk to someone about who you are and what you've done, that's a narrative, right? Every hiring process is a narrative that you kind of are consuming. So we tell the people who are coming on board, you're here on a mission, you're working on multiple visions and missions at the end of the day. And once you complete that mission, there's a journey, there's a story that you'll be able to say, right? And we start off the conversation by saying, let's talk about what the journey is going to look like for you, right? 3 years from now, when you're going to look back, what are you going to be able to say? Right? These are the missions I worked towards. These are the skills that I mastered, right? These are the battles and monsters that I slayed, right? And help my company or my org or the larger quest win, right? That's how they should speak about it. That's their resume at the end of the day, right? That's their journey. So that conversation is very good with for most of the folks because they don't think of it that particular way. The moment they think of it, even when they kind of join in that particular way, their daily operation style also kind of changes because you're talking about missions, and one mission fails, so what, right? You might jump onto another mission with the renewed energy because that's what games tell you. You might get defeated one day, one of the missions, you learn from that, and then it's a learning exercise. So the mindset itself changes when they kind of approach it from that particular perspective. So that is just introducing that into the language. When it comes down to collaboration, right? And in most games, you have guilds and clans. You're not a one-man army at the end of the day, right? You're working in tandem. You might be playing a game like PUBG and somebody is sniping, somebody else is playing a different sort of a role, right? Somebody else is probably aggressively charging down, right? And somebody is, hanging back and kind of waiting for people to kind of come by. So there are different roles that you play in games naturally. And anybody who's played games or sports knows that there are roles to be played out, and everybody has that contribution out there. So when you're looking at individuals, it's easy to kind of motivate them, but to get the cohesive teams to operate, you need to again structure them as a sport team or as a game team, right? And tell, hey, this is the role that you'll be being able to play at this point of time. And they're receptive to that because now they know that we value all of those various kinds of roles that exist, because all of that in tandem is what helps the mission being successful, right? So then there is the amount of comparisons that come across, with one person comparing themselves to another person out there, because the roles are different, right? The challenges are different, and the way that we acknowledge and respect them is different. Those comparisons and negative, demotivations kind of coming into the system kind of reduces to an extent out there, right? So that's again classic game design principle being applied, talking about guilds, clans, talking about the different roles that you play within that. So that's what I would kind of recommend. I would recommend that while frameworks exist, take those human motivations and then try to apply them, whether it's in the hiring process, whether it's in the goal setting process, whether it's in the pods where you structure a pods. Our pods are structured in BYJU's, all teams are structured as pods, and those are cross-functional pods. We have a design member, we have an engineer, we have your learning designer, we have the academician, because they all come together to make that happen. And we go from concept phase to pre-production phase to production phase, right? Concept phase is a smaller team coming together, working towards various goals. The way we structure the mission for them is very simple. The success criteria and the fail criteria is very different. And once they've proved the concept, then we kind of expand that and things like that. The other aspect I think which is very critical that I have kind of probably incorporated partially, and I think needs to be done a lot more, is games are great from a feedback mechanism. Why do games really work? That very concerted, focused environment, every action that you do, there is feedback, right? Either the heads-up display items are responding or the environment is responding. That feedback is giving you clarity as to what needs to be done next, what needs to be done next. In orgs, teams spend a lot of time without getting feedback, right? Without them knowing whether the mission is going right or not, or if there needs to be tweaks and all of that. Once you structure that as missions, and they're all kind of gamifying their own approach to how to kind of crack those missions, the very important aspect that an org needs to support them, the leadership needs to support them, is with clear feedback happening, in intermediate stages itself, not after the mission is achieved or failed, right? So that games do it really, really well. And if you can structure your org for feedback, right, and for feedback from peers saying, okay, I could really need your help here, right? I need to cover my back when I'm kind of doing this, right? I need support on this particular element because this is failing at this point of time. Once that language comes in, it becomes very easy for us to converse, and for leadership to kind of give feedback to the teams. Okay, you're failing here, or these things you might need to tweak. We feel that this is what is happening. You guys go out there, dissect that, and come back and tell us if that is true or not. See if you have any other ideas. I think that feedback cycle puts pressure on the org because it's not easy to do feedback, right? We're running at a crazy pace. So feedback, instead of doing it 6 months and doing it as a very laborious process, and then people feeling that it's too late, or I feel like I've been judged unfairly or fairly. If you can lighten the feedback, right? Because games give you constant feedback, and lighten the intensity of the feedback so that, only the death condition or the kill condition happens rarely, right? And most of the times you're getting, elemental feedback on small things that you're doing. I think that has to be baked into the process. Again, it's a game design approach. It is not a framework, it's a way of thinking, but that can be, baked into how the org functions.
Got it. Thanks for explaining that entire part. Uh, I want to understand now that, because look, most of the things you mentioned are aligned to the human motivation, right? When you apply the game design principle. So what I meant by this is that if it's aligned to human motivation, somewhere we are also targeting a self-sustenance. Somewhere targeting that you don't need to do additional activities to motivate the team, right? To kind of, and then to put them may not be an autopilot, but somewhere self-driven. So do you think to an extent applying these game design principles also help putting the team in that autopilot mode, wherein you don't have to work very hard to drive them, to motivate them, because this is what it's already taking care of it?
Yeah, it comes down to, I think, using intrinsic motivation really well, right? Game design principles essentially work on intrinsic motivation. Right? What drives a human? What makes a human aspire to do more, right? So that's where intrinsic motivation kind of comes by, and all the game design principles we are touching upon is to kind of push the intrinsic motivation. That is not, when I kind of, I have a lot of respect for intrinsic motivation. We try to kind of think about how can we drive more intrinsic motivation, because you're right. If you have intrinsic motivation cracked in an org, or how product development happens, then a lot of it becomes autopilot. Things happen naturally, and then you have this culture and DNA also happening, naturally in the product development teams. But that is not to say that there is no benefit from extrinsic motivation as well. Explicit rewards also work, right? Because there are elements which will, for example, the motivation of status and being able to say that I'm an achiever requires you to be set aside from the rest of the people out there. And sometimes, while that's a motivation, that can only happen through external acknowledgement, reward, right? A pat on the back, and those systems out there, right? A promotion, an appraisal hike, all those are also kind of motivations that you kind of have as extrinsic motivations. When we design our products, right, we try to kind of bake in both intrinsic motivation. The entire process of engaging with the product, the core loop of the product has to be fun. And at certain points, you also do extrinsic motivation, right? Because, for example, when you kind of do a Google Pay payment and then you have the reward at the end of the day, right? That whole process is fun. Even the action of, having the scratch or opening a mystery box is also fun, because those are all naturally intrinsic motivation driven. But the reward also matters, right? But sometimes the extrinsic motivation does not need to be very, very high if you've done the intrinsic motivation really, really well, right? So you can play around with that. You can make it variable and all of that. So the extrinsic motivation, I think, also plays an important role, and that's seen in how we build products and how we kind of build teams as well. But sometimes extrinsic motivation, if you only focus on extrinsic motivations, it's a treadmill that never stops. Bigger and bigger extrinsic motivation rewards, and there is no high, right? Because the moment one extrinsic reward is achieved, you go for a bigger one, and the previous one does not kind of seem compelling enough. But that's not true for intrinsic motivation. For you, the same repeated motivation intrinsically keeps you satisfied, keeps you very, very moved, and it's very, very focused, right? And it's very sustainable. So that's the benefit of intrinsic motivation. I'm not saying that extrinsic motivation is not critical. I think it's important as well, but it does not need to be crazy high, and it can be a lot more sustainable loop if you follow the intrinsic motivation being coupled with the extrinsic motivation.
Got it. Got that part. Moving on to the other side now. Look, somewhere when we are applying storytelling or applying the game design principles, consciously or subconsciously, we're trying to imbibe certain value systems into the people, into the product which we are building, both, right? And so what are those value systems, or what are those values which you think are imbibed the most by taking these route of incorporating storytelling or game design principles? So things like transparency, things like accountability, what are those? If I have to pinpoint, let's say, few of those values, what will be those?
Yeah, I think the first value system that comes very, very clearly across from the benefit of using storytelling and game design principles is that when you're building an org or a product line at the end of the day, right, you don't want to be building it for anybody but the user, right? There might be motivations. There might be somebody else in the meeting room who might, have a higher louder voice. There might be somebody who's higher paid than you, and them. It's very possible to have a culture which is top down, right? And that's detrimental to the success of the org, because then you're not really kind of going deep in. What it does is, I think product discovery becomes very, very powerful, right? That's one culture that we kind of benefit from, because how are the meetings going to be run? It's going to be run by talking about the user personas, the challenges, the user's journey very clearly. For that to happen, product discovery has to be very, very strong. You have to engage with users. You have to talk to them. There are changes happening out there. There has to be proof points. There has to be insights, user insights being generated. So the product discovery process becomes very, very strong, because nobody can come into that discussion without having done their homework on product discovery, right? And that is set aside and made as the truth. Now, it's very different for very difficult for any team to come by, or any individual to come by and randomize that process, because at the end of the day, that's the holy truth. You have the user very clearly defined, the journey and all of that. Where I've seen orgs kind of fail sometimes is that user is not clear, and everybody has their opinion of what is happening on the ground, right? And properly, people kind of pride themselves for their own understanding, their own read of the situation, and good. It's a good thing, because they kind of pride themselves on that. But if you can take that randomization out, if you can take that variability out and kind of put it out there, product discovery becomes unified, right? And when product discovery becomes unified, there is no politics in the system. There is nobody who can kind of barrel through and get their features through, so as to speak. There are no ulterior motives. The only motive is that of being able to kind of achieve that for the user. So that's product discovery becomes super strong, and there's one view of the user and the user journey for the entire org. I think it's a very, very powerful aspect, and something that people kind of underrate substantially, because I can see that drives the efficiency and the velocity of the team, as opposed to the speed. The direction also becomes right when they kind of do that. The second part of it, the culture of being able to say, okay, I'm on a mission. These are my goals, right? This is how we all kind of operate towards. When that language comes by, I think collaboration becomes very, 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 very clear, right? Because it's goal-oriented collaboration and role-oriented collaboration happening simultaneously, right? Because at the end of the day, for that mission, the goal is very, very clearly defined. The objectives are very, very clearly agreed upon. And then the role objectives, right? Each of the teams have different ways to contribute. And the incentives are also kind of aligned accordingly. For example, a product person might want to kind of work towards a particular feature, and then the operations team might say, what is in it for me, right? And I have my existential problems. Why should I kind of solve this? Because they're not thinking about the user at that point of time, right? But if your goals and your incentives are linked to the achievement of that specific mission successfully, and we know that everybody's contributing to the role, and if the mission fails, if the implications are on all of the team constituents or components, irrespective of which team you come from, whether it's from operations, logistics, or any other academic team, if the implications are on all of them, then the cross-functional collaboration becomes a lot more strong, as opposed to everyone saying it's not my problem, right? So I think that unification of goal, right, and the role coming together to be able to achieve that collaboration-based mission, I think that culture also is very, very strong. The third element I would say is a sense of learning. When you have mission coming in, the objective is to, of course, achieve the mission. But how do orgs grow faster and make it a competitive advantage? I've always said that learning from your mistakes is a competitive advantage, right? And it's not just learning, right, in a vague way. If you can document, okay, what happened in the mission? Where did we kind of fail through, right? What could have been done differently? If you do the postmortem of a particular mission, and people do that, right? Once a mission is done, you get the stats. How did this go? And then a gamer is thinking about what could I have gone differently? I should have done this, right? Oh, we've had this person coming by this point of time. Think of it in that particular way. And once you document the learnings, it is not from the perspective of finger pointing and figuring out who to pin the blame on, but rather to say, okay, this is where the collective mission failed. This is where the collaboration failed. Now let's do the postmortem. Let's understand, what were the learnings from that, document it. I think it's very important to kind of document the learnings. In Zynga, we used to do this beautifully, because all games used to learn from each other, and they used to have sharing of learnings happening on a weekly basis. And that is all done from a first principles. This is what we learned, right, about human behavior. This is what we tried out. This is how it kind of did. So there is subjective aspects, there is user insight aspect, there is quantitative data to kind of show the proof points, and then you have a body of knowledge that the entire org can and other pods can benefit from.
All right. So Ranjit, now I'm just thinking of it, whatever you explained, and while I understand that uniformly, whether it's an enterprise company or a B2C, applying these principles, applying storytelling, applying game design principles for the team building from the team and organization side, it's same. But do you think somewhere that from the product side, that it is slightly more relevant when you're building for the consumers directly versus when you're building for enterprises? Do you think that?
The honest answer is yes. I would say there is slightly more elements to think about, right? When you're kind of building a direct consumer product. But that's not to say that the no elements of game design or storytelling applies to when you're building products of other kind as well, right? At the end of the day, it is a user, right? Maybe the user in say a SaaS product is not the person who's purchasing it, right? Or maybe it is. Right? There are different structures to the story, right? And different characters in the story in all elements out there, right? And maybe the buying decision is very simple. The way that the motivation comes out there in a consumer product, it's probably a lot of fundamental human motivations. Here, it might be slightly more less emotion driven, slightly more functionality driven. The weightages might change, right? If the weightages change, right, as to what is the driving motivation, what's a singular thing to prioritize, those are only aspects of the story arc which is changing, and then some characters which are changing, right? So the same principles hold true, is what I would kind of say. There are a lot more aspects to consider, a lot more human motivations to cater to when you're building a direct to consumer product, which is being used by the masses. If it is not being used by the masses, it's being used by a niche audience, then it's a slightly more smaller segment. Maybe the character, there's not too much of variability in the characters that you're dealing with. All those are just elements of the story arc, the environment, the context is setting, the characters which are changing. But how you approach it, the thought process, I don't think should change, right? I think it's at the end of the day, the same elements, you bake the same process, you do the collaboration, you do the post-mortem, you learn from it, you do that whole product karmic cycle of, doing this for a particular user, completing the journey, learning from it, that cycle, right? Really, really well. And at the end of the day, every product, I think, whether it's a B2B, B2C product, has a core loop, right? And is being used by humans, right? If it's a product that's being consumed by machines for certain other objectives, then that's a different thing altogether. But as long as you have human touch points in the product's journey, right, then the power of storytelling and game design principles really, really matter. Now, inward facing for an org, irrespective of whether you're building for a B2C product or for a B2B product, I think those principles are true, because we are operating with human beings building a particular product. I think everything that we spoke about can be powerfully used to drive, org efficiency and org success in no matter which sort of a sector you are.
Correct. Cool. Moving on to the last question, which is that in your experience, tell us what can go wrong. Because one is that people see this video, or in general, people get to know about storytelling and use of storytelling and game design principles in their product journey, in the organization alignment and everything. And but when they kind of go about applying those things, it could be sometimes the domain, it could be sometimes the team formation, it could be sometimes what particular teams you're dealing with and all. But what can go wrong according to you, or what has gone wrong in your experience?
I'll tell you some of the arguments against it, right? Because since I've been an evangelist of that, I've seen a lot of counter viewpoints as well, right? Sometimes it's a point that's being raised that, okay, it's intensive, right? It's too much of commitment, right? To kind of bake the storytelling process every single time. We want to just walk in, decide upon a few things and go out, right? That's sometimes, there is inertia in the teams to be able to kind of adopt to a storytelling element, right? That can only happen through, constantly kind of showcasing the benefits of it. So it has to be adopted, it has to be tried out, sometimes getting alignment from all teams. You might say, okay, this is all great, but sometimes my engineers may not care about the larger narrative. They're talking about whether that, what they're building out from a technological piece is scalable, is efficient, is most optimized. They're not really kind of concerned about how this sits in with the larger narrative. Through that, always my response is because at the end of the day, all humans care about what they're building, right? And of course, what that kind of translates into. It's only because the storytelling was not strong enough, or not inclusive enough, or not made powerful enough to connect with them, right? So that means that there is more effort kind of required out there. One of the other cons that I kind of hear is that this can be hijacked. The process of storytelling can be hijacked against you. In the sense that if sometimes, say, when you do storytelling and then you set up goals, those goals and missions can be gamified. And we gamers do that, right? We're always trying to hack our way through, trying to figure out the cheat codes out there to be able to kind of achieve that mission. Now you can gamify achieving a metric. If you have figured out that, okay, this is the goal I'm working towards, and these are the metrics or dipsticks that help us measure whether that goal is being achieved or not. It is possible to game your way towards achieving those metrics, right? Going about it in the wrong way, right? Because you want to crack the mission, right? So cracking the mission becomes such a singular focus that sometimes they forget about, how are they going about doing it, right? And they don't care about it as long as the end justifies the means sort of an approach comes into the picture. That's where I think it's not just about just defining the goals and the narrative, but also ensuring that when people are kind of responding to the narrative and they kind of are building things, that journey is also kind of cared about, because that's where the catch-ups between the teams, your stand-ups come by, your retrospectives kind of come by to figure out whether while this mission was being accomplished, was it being done in the right fashion? Otherwise, the wrong culture can kind of come in. I remember in certain times when you're kind of building games, you want to kind of bump up revenue, and it's possible to kind of worsen the user experience or the player experience and achieve the revenue targets, right? And so your goal and mission is achieved, but what you're left is a inferior game experience for your, and that's true for products as well, right? When pods are working towards some particular metric, and you say, okay, it's nice, it's mission oriented, it's goal, they get all excited about it, but then it's all about cracking it and hacking their way towards it, and suddenly you left the user somewhere at the on the back burner. That's where I think storytelling implemented right is important, because you have to keep the user still at the center of it. You have to achieve a mission without burning the hero of the journey, which is your user, right? So it is not simple to implement, but once you implement it, right, and that cycle and DNA kind of sets in, then its payoff is really, really high. So that's some of the challenges that you would have in terms of being able to build this as a culture and a DNA within your org.
That was slightly diplomatic, but I'll take that. I'll take that. I think that's all we have. Thanks, Ranjit, again for joining in and having this conversation on such an interesting topic, which was the role of storytelling and game design principles in building products and teams. Thanks everyone for watching. Again, it was a pleasure to host you.
Thank you, Alok. Thank you, everyone. Take care.